Chapter 13
Part
in
2.
the International Relations class is looking at international development. The OECD, which I've already introduced you to just shortly, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. 35 members, the richest states of the world, and the 8 richest states of the world. The G8 generates about 62% of the entire world's gross national product, so that shows you how disproportional the global capitalist structure is. The G8 does serve as somewhat of a forum for global public diplomacy, to where every now and then, whether it's the G8 summits, now they meet to spread it out a little bit. They meet as the G20 summits, and these are the economic leaders. They're at the direction of their country's leaders that are kind of mapping out the direction of the global capitalist system. So that's kind of how it works. And you could also argue that the critics of that would, particularly the anti-globalization critics, would say that, oh, well, this is kind of the shadow world government that's calling the shots, pulling the strings behind the scenes. And yes, maybe so, but that's kind of how it works. If the rich countries of the world get together and say, how can we work together? That's not necessarily a bad thing. Now, obviously, the rest of the world, if they want to play along, they have to kind of get plugged in to this system that is already here and doing fairly well for the rich countries. The problem, of course, is how the poor countries can get plugged into it. Lots of issues with the global south, poorest countries of the world, this technological transfer of information, patents and intellectual property. The multinational corporations would be, it'd be perhaps benefit for them to share the knowledge with their host state, but that doesn't always happen. The multinationals, this, like I said, this is patented intellectual property, and multinationals lease that out or sell it in order to make money off of that technology. So it's a very controversial topic, because if you might argue that if multinationals didn't have the incentive to do these patents that could make them a lot of profit, well, then maybe there wouldn't be as much motivation to go out and try to create this stuff. But then again, if you had that shared out to where everybody's using it equally, then you would have considerable more opportunity for development spread out. The brain drain is what is referred to when the educated elites that are in poor countries, they go to the rich countries to get educated at the best schools, and then have a tendency to stay in the rich countries. So therefore, the poor countries not getting as much benefit out of that. There's quite a bit of debt. The South owes at least $4 trillion in foreign debt. That's loans from other countries and from international organizations. And in order to maintain their credibility, they have to pay the interest on that loans. This is what is called debt service. And that is a burden on our budget, on any budget. I just was talking on another class as far as looking at the annual budget, and about 12% of the U.S. federal budget is paying interest on its debt, and that's more than likely going to go up. That's about the fourth highest expense in federal government. And then if the states default on their loans, that could really hurt their credibility, hurt their future prospects. Might have to renegotiate that, go through some sort of bankruptcy type proceedings. And then there's also there's ideas out there of forgiving debt and starting over. Looking at more issues, particularly with the International Monetary Fund. That's the impossible mission for us, so that's not what we're talking about. But the IMF imposes conditions on the poor states in order to get this money. And this is what we call structural adjustment, to where the poor countries need to open up to free trade, privatize their major industries. So that's kind of getting it out of the socialist aspect right there. And that is somewhat controversial, because not every state might be geared or set up to do it this way. They may have to figure out how to do it with their cultural norms and then make that adjustment accordingly, rather than everybody having to fit the same boilerplate template here in order to get plugged in to this global capitalist system. So that IMF conditionality has been critiqued quite a bit. These reforms are required in order to get these low interest loans, and then the things that they may have to do in those countries, which might be austerity measures, which would be to cut back spending and raise taxes in order to try to get back on a footing to where they would be set up to get these loans. That's politically unpopular. I talked about the BRICS, the emerging markets. They have created, particularly motivated by China, a new $100 billion development bank that is looking to be an alternative to the International Monetary Fund as far as being able to loan out development loans to developing countries without the same conditions that IMF would require. Some more issues with the South on trade. It's harder for the poor states to protect their infant industries. They don't have the resources to do that, but yet they need to export, and they have a hard time competing with the rich countries that are protecting their domestic industries. And this has been the biggest issue with the WTO. The poor states actually have somewhat of an advantage in producing agriculture and textiles because of the labor force is more geared toward that rather than technological goods, but they still have to compete with the United States and the EU that pay billions of dollars of subsidies to their agricultural industry so that their farmers would not be threatened by the poor country farmers. So this is a big issue with the WTO, and the last rounds, the negotiations that they had, the WTO negotiations literally fell apart over this issue. The rich states, as we've already talked about, have the comparative advantage in the manufactured goods. So the poor states' exports are shut out of foreign markets because of this advantage, and the least developed countries' exports are only 24% of the entire world's total of manufactured goods. When, as they start to develop, they would certainly want that to pick up dramatically in order to improve their economies. We've seen this one before. The poorest countries of the world typically still have to rely on primary product exports. These are the basic agricultural products and basic minerals and ores that are sent to the rich countries for them to develop those into commodities and other finished products and then sell back out to the rest of the country, perhaps even sell back to the poor countries. So when the poor countries can develop their industrial capacity, then they can use those primary products in creating their own capacity for exporting finished products and commodities. So they still have a ways to go in these areas that still rely, as I said before, a lot of this is subsistence farming, to where families are just farming what they're able to farm to live on day to day rather than putting it into industrial capacity to export. Foreign assistance is another controversial issue, particularly when you look from the United States point of view. The general public opinion of foreign aid is not very good. Overall, there's about a total of $130 billion in 2012, and 90% of that came from what we call Development Assistance Committee, the DAC, which is the richest states of the world, much like the OECD, where those states submit or send out the vast majority of foreign direct investment. Well, the rich states also provide the vast majority of foreign aid. Got two different types of foreign aid. Bilateral aid is directly from the rich state to the recipient government, and that is more politically attractive to states like the United States because that way they can kind of control where that goes. The target for bilateral aid is 0.7% of a state's gross national income. The United States is considerably lower than that. We'll look at a table here in a minute. Multilateral aid is where the states give their money to an IO. The biggest IOs would, of course, be the UN and the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. And the would then pool that and then send it out to other countries. That's why it's called multilateral aid. And this money is used to try to develop the technology, to develop the workforce, to work on capital concentration, to improve research in those countries. And a lot of that, even though there are dues that the rich states have to pay to be members of the IMF and the World Bank, UN, these groups also rely a lot on voluntary contributions to do a lot of these specific programs that might target something in a poor state that would help them develop. Now, when we look at the UN target at 0.7% here, the United States, as I've already mentioned, is pretty far down on this list. No surprise here, the Scandinavian countries are exceeding that target, but most states are below that target as far as foreign aid. And there's a lot of arguments on this that foreign aid, no matter how much you send to another country, it's not going to really do all that much good. And then there's other school of thought that says that if the rich countries got together and sent considerably more foreign aid, they could solve a lot of these problems. So it goes either way, and hard to determine right now where we are. But when we look at the actual amount sent, obviously the United States sends the most because we have the biggest economy in the world. But as far as percent of our GNI, we are fairly far down on the list there as far as the OECD, or in this case the DAC states that are sending the bulk of the foreign aid. The issues with foreign aid does not always address the causes of poverty. If that money is going from one state to another state's government, that state might decide to use it for something else, such as perhaps even building military weapons. It can also be used as leverage for political purposes. So if a rich state is wanting a poor state to help them in the war on terror, then they might dangle that foreign aid and says, okay, we'll give you this foreign aid if you comply with what we need you to do in this particular political agenda, geopolitical purpose. And if the rich state knows that that money might be used to make or to buy weapons, well, then they could actually give that to the poor state and say, okay, we're going to give you this aid, and we know you're going to use it to buy weapons with, so therefore we're going to require you to buy U.S.-made weapons. That's another thing that the rich state can do. That's another issue with it. Also, the idea that much of it is wasted, or that it falls into the hands of corrupt administrators, because going from the top down, it trickles down, and it may get weeded out through corruption. And the U.S., as I said, requires some certain things with its foreign aid program. Requires U.S. food, for example, to be shipped from the U.S. in U.S. vessels. So therefore, the foreign aid industry, so to speak, is also benefiting a lot of groups, interest groups, that are getting a slice of the pie from this foreign aid as well. Whereas on the other side, if the U.S. put those funds directly into the local economy to buy local food, not only it would save money, it could potentially help the local farmers by doing that. So as I said, the agribusiness industry, the shipping industries, and even the charities, that even if they're nonprofit, yes, they want to stay viable, they are using their lobbying power to get some of this benefit out of this U.S. Foreign aid amounts there. So those are some of the main issues with foreign aid that make it controversial. So now let's sum it up here and talk about the comparison between the economic internationalism direction and the economic nationalism type direction. That's kind of what we started off with back when we initiated the conversations on the economic development is that there's two basic approaches, and there's overlaps, of course, but looking at the advantages of economic internationalism, of the neoliberalist approach to where we're trying to build this global capitalist economy. Well, the general prosperity that, as we see with this global internationalist approach, states do tend to benefit from it. Everybody does tend to see their economic development generally rise, despite the fact that, yes, it's still unequal. But the ideas of specialization and comparative advantage are being utilized here in this economic internationalist approach. There's less cost of protectionism when you do that. There's less tariffs, there's less subsidies. We're trying to develop the earth as a global market to where we can get the best product for the best price. We are spreading out the capital in more areas for development, which the poor states desperately need. Talking about globalization, I said they all tend to lead to some consensus here, is that the more internationally engaged we are with our economy, the more potential there is for peace and security, because states are becoming reliant on each other, interdependent upon each other. And it's less likely for you to go to war against somebody that you trade with or is investing in you or that you are interdependent with in your economy. And democracy has been, as I've said before, somewhat of a package deal with market systems. So as market systems spread around the globe, then the incentive for democratic systems would also be there as kind of a package deal. Now, with the pushback against democracy that we've talked about, and the fact that China remains authoritarian, Russia is increasingly authoritarian. We've already talked about Turkey and even Poland and Hungary, states that are pushing a little bit more authoritarian. Even United States moving a little bit more nationalism. Well, then that's going to be an interesting question as to whether or not democracy is going to be remaining compatible with an international economic pursuits. Now, looking at the incentives for economic nationalism, we will always have domestic priorities. As long as we have these sovereign states, there will always be first priorities. How the jobs doing in our state? How do we handle the recession in our state? What is the possibility of a ripple effect from another country? How do we guard against that with respect to our own priorities? There's and of course, the Trump administration was a pretty big believer in this concept right here that free traders typically get taken advantage of. Nice guy free traders, such as the Trump administration, had been talking about how the United States had been not getting the good end of these deals. And come in and make better deals, focusing on how we can benefit from these deals. So that is still a common refrain that's a pushback against the internationalist economy and leaning back more towards a nationalist economy. And you would still have the incentives for controlling your economy as far as national security goes. If we are still worried about our national security, well, then we're going to focus on those industries that promote our national security. We could also use our national economy as a domestic policy tool. And the thing that we want to perhaps also protect is our own social culture, our own way of life, our own environmental protection. And if multinationals are going out and being able to pick and choose where they want to operate and not be held to standards, well, then the multinationals could be exploiting the environment or exploiting safety, exploiting cheap labor, and that would also bring out a lot of criticism of that in order to try to avoid what we talked about as a race to the bottom in standards by letting some of those go in order to let multinationals come in to the poor countries and operate. But that is the summation there on the global economy. So we will get into what we're doing is jumping back to a previous chapter because I wanted to cover the economics together in one group, and then I'm going to go back for the last week of class and talk about the environment.